and we're so excited. Thanks for having us be with you guys today to learn from you all and listen to the conversations you're having. So some of you may have read this book today. I'm going to do an interactive read aloud. I'm going to read this book, and at some points I'm going to ask you guys to turn and talk about your thinking, and then at the end we're going to have a whole class conversation. So you may or may not have read this book before. This book is called Balloons Over Broadway, the true story of the puppeteer of Macy's Parade. So I know that you guys have been doing a lot of work in your book clubs and throughout the past couple of weeks around characters, and after you guys finish up characters, you're going to be moving into reading a lot of narrative nonfiction books. So this is a little preview to some of the books that you're going to be reading in the upcoming weeks. So before I get started, I want to just tell you a little bit about this book and the character. So in this book, we're going to meet Tony Sarg and learn about his passion for figuring out how things move. And this passion takes him on a journey like through his entire life. And we're going to learn about some marionettes are puppets that are attached at the top, and they have strings that are attached to the top, and you move them so that they look lifelike. So we're going to talk about marionettes throughout this, okay? So let's learn about Tony Sarg. He says, every little movement has a meaning of its own. That's a quote by Tony. From the time he was a little boy, Tony Sarg loved to figure out how to make things move. He once said he became a marionette man when he was only 6 years old. His father had asked him to feed their chickens at 6:30 in the morning every day. Tony had an idea. What if he could feed the chickens without leaving his bed? He rigged up some pulleys and ran rope from the chicken coop door to his bedroom window. That night, he spread chicken feed outside the chicken coop door. So this is his plan. It says spread the feed the night before, pull rope, door opens, chickens come out. The next morning, alarm goes off at 6:30, Tony pulled the rope and the door to the chicken coop opened. The chickens ate their breakfast, Tony stayed snug in his bed, and his dad, so impressed, never made Tony do another chore. So I'm noticing that Tony has quite the curious mind. But I want you to turn and talk to a neighbor. What are you thinking about that?
Daddy's creative.
Alright, and we're going to come back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When Tony grew up, he moved to London, where he discovered that no one was making marionettes for kids anymore. So out of wood, cloth, and strings, Tony began to make puppets. He figured out ways to make his marionettes move so lifelike that they performed as if they were real actors. Word soon spread about Tony's amazing marionettes. When Tony moved to New York City, the Tony Sarg marionettes began performing on Broadway. In the heart of New York City, in Herald Square, was the biggest store on earth, R.H. Macy's department store. Macy's had heard about Tony's puppets and asked him to design a puppet parade for the store's holiday windows. So Tony made new puppets based on storybook characters, then attached them to gears and pulleys to make them move. This page shows some of his plans for that. Macy's Wondertown. In Macy's Wondertown windows, Tony's mechanical marionettes danced across the stage as if by magic. All day long, they performed to shoppers, jostling for a better look. But Macy's had an even bigger job in store for Tony. Many of the people working at Macy's were immigrants, and as the holidays approached, they missed their own holiday traditions of music and dancing in the streets. Macy's agreed to put on a parade for their employees, and they hired Tony to help. Tony, too, was an immigrant, so he loved the idea of creating a parade based on street carnivals from all over the world. He made costumes and built horse-drawn floats, and Macy's even arranged to bring in bears, elephants, and camels from the Central Park Zoo. So I'm going to reread. But Macy's had an even bigger job in store for Tony. Let's take a look at him. Go ahead and turn and talk. What are you thinking?
Okay.
No, I think it's gonna be horse air balloons, and make them like they're gonna hold tamales and some Chinese food, like some rolls. It's gonna be like a big He's just like things gonna make us animals. He's not gonna have a Chinese rolls. Yeah, why wouldn't he? He's trying to hold represent why wouldn't he? He's trying to represent like the country. Exactly. Not the immigrants.
Okay, I'm gonna add on.
Okay, come on in.
Come back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The animals joined hundreds of Macy's employees on Thanksgiving Day 1924, winding their way from Harlem to Herald Square. It was a dazzling parade. In fact, Macy's first parade was such a success that they decided to have one every year on Thanksgiving Day to celebrate America's own holiday. Each year, the parade grew. But when Macy's brought in lions and tigers, in addition to the bears, elephants, and camels, the animals roared and growled and frightened the children. Macy's asked Tony to replace the animals. This is Mr. Macy. Tony, can you think of something spectacular? Okay. Tony hoped to replace the animals with some kind of puppets, but his marionettes were less than 3 feet tall. He would have to make much larger puppets in order for them to be seen in the parade. And how could he make them strong enough to hold up in bad weather, yet light enough to move up and down in the streets? Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. When he called the company and showed them his sketches, they agreed to make what Tony wanted. Still, how would Tony make his big puppets move? Then Tony had an idea from an Indonesian rod puppet in his toy collection. On Thanksgiving Day, Tony's creatures, some as high as 16 feet, spilled into the streets and the crowds cheered wildly. Part puppet, part balloon, the air-filled rubber bags wobbled down the avenues propped up by wooden sticks. So I'm noticing a change in the parade each year. What are you thinking about that? Turn and talk.
Okay. So he's more bigger puppets. I don't think I'm gonna make like a replica. Okay, so more modern ones.
No, because last year was animals. It's a puppet animal. What if we had technology back then?
How they're made.
Coming back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But now the sidewalks were so packed with people that only those in the first few rows could really see the parade. Tony realized his puppets would have to be even bigger and even higher off the ground. And though the sticks helped to steer the puppets, they were stiff and heavy. Tony wanted his balloons to articulate, to move and gesture, more like puppets, but how? With a marionette, the controls are above and the puppet hangs down. But what if the controls were below and the puppet could rise up? During the next year, Tony sets his new idea into motion. This time, he asked the company in Ohio to make balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber, but lighter than rubber alone. Most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air, but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. Once the puppets were completed, they were deflated and shipped back to Tony in New York. Tony did not know if everything would go as planned. What if the balloons filled with too much helium? What if one hits a sharp object? Will they fit under the L, which is an elevated train track that they have to go under on the parade route? It was still dark on Thanksgiving morning when Tony filled the balloons with helium, tethering them down with sandbags. By 1 p.m., the sidewalks were packed with people ready for the parade. Then, one by one, Tony cut the lines to the sandbags. So this seems a little stressful to me. He's not sure if it's going to work. What are you thinking about Tony right now? And the magnificent upside-down marionettes rose to the skies. Nodding and waving to the crowds below, they sailed past Central Park, they sallied down Broadway, they shimmied and swayed through the canyons of New York City. High above the crowds, they flounced in the afternoon wind, pulling the rope handlers this way and that. Yet with every heave-ho, the balloons gestured and articulated like wild puppets, and the crowd screamed for more. After the balloons were eased up under the L, they ended in front of Macy's out Tony's Watertown windows. It was a parade New Yorkers would never forget. And from that day on, every Thanksgiving morning, crowds have lined the sidewalks of New York City to see what new balloons would rise to the skies for Macy's famous parade. Tony Sarg, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage with a little rigging for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. I'm going to reread that last line again. Tony Sarg, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage with a little rigging for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. What are you thinking about what the author said here? Turn it off.
You can make
If you actually try, then you can
Okay, I think that maybe we'll like those are the things that make compared to those
Okay, let's go back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to give some explanation and then I'm going to ask you guys to move. So now what we're going to do is we are going to have a whole class conversation about some things within this book. So I'm going to give us some choices to pick from, but before I give you those choices, I want us to get into, we can't do like a full circle, but I do think we have more than enough space to get into like an oval so that everybody can see everyone. So go ahead and take a moment to shift, and you guys can fill in front of me, so there'll be space here. Come on in, I want you in the circle. Hold on, Emily's not in. Can everybody shift that way just a tiny bit? And then Emily, you'll be able to sit right in front of me. Keep going, keep going. Shift, shift, shift. And then
scoot over.
we need you to come in too. What's your name? Aiden. Aiden, there's actually some space between Mohammed and Alexis. Touch his hand. Awesome. Okay. So when we think about this book, there's a couple different things that we could talk about. I'm going to give us some three choices. And I want you to think about which one of these choices could we talk about for a really long time, okay? And actually, before I do that, I'm going to give us some rules. So we'll pause on our choices. When we talk today, some rules for a whole class conversation, you don't need to raise your hand during this time to offer an idea and to talk. So we're not going to go one person at a time, like raise hand and call on. Say that again? Yeah, you guys just did a Socratic seminar, so it's going to be similar. So you guys are ready for this. But along with Socratic seminar, some of the behaviors are we're going to make sure that we're listening to one another and our eyes are on the person that's talking, and that we're careful not to like interrupt one another. We let each other complete our ideas and then we add on. So thinking about, which I think you guys, what, did your Socratic seminar just the end of last week?
Finished Friday.
Awesome, Nehemiah. Thanks for bringing us back to that because you guys are ready to have that conversation. Okay, so I'm going to put 3 ideas, and I want you to think about the story and which one of these ideas we could talk about for a pretty long time, okay? The first thing that I was thinking we could talk about is like innovation. And so thinking about how ideas come and grow, and we have that curiosity, and we develop some like creative and new ideas. We could also talk about perseverance, and so when things are really difficult or hard or challenging, like not giving up and continuing to go. And then another thing we could talk about in this book would be change. So we could talk about innovation, we could talk about perseverance, or we could talk about change. So take a moment to think to yourself, and then we're going to just vote as a class. Who would like to talk about innovation? Okay. All right. Who would like to talk about perseverance? All right. Who wants to talk about change? I think we have a clear winner. So we're going to be thinking about, again, balloons over Broadway, thinking about change. Okay. And anyone can get us started.
What are we talking about again?
Change.
Can I start?
Yeah.
So, it changed about how he was making puppets that were 3 feet long, high, to making it like 16 feet wide and big, and making new ideas about making new puppets and stuff.
Well, he kind of started with making little gadgets for his house. Like, he started making, not exactly a self-feeder, but helping him feed the chickens when he was like 6.
or 7, and he really liked marionette puppets when he was little. But when he started to go out the zoo, he started to do a lot bigger projects, like making parades, and some of the biggest parades ever.
Yeah, but then like you saw, he started out with like just tiny things that could help, and then at the end of the book, he was like, made something really.
When they first started the parades, it was like cool stuff, but then it just turned into puppets. Like at first it was like lions and bears and elephants, and then he turned into like rubber.
Yeah, at first it was just like a regular parade, but then it was sort of like a a regular parade to get wild animals there. Yeah.
Yeah, they have tigers.
They're domesticated.
That's in the
At first,
Yeah,
they brought him,
domesticated.
like, not intimidating animals.
yeah.
But then the second parade, they brought in tigers and lions, and they started to care of the children. So they needed to bring in less intimidating things.
So they did like
But the animals like
Tigers and lions.
Like balloons.
Yeah, but
like caterpillars.
the children didn't like
Sound. It's just that they were too small. Like you said, the people won't be able to see it like back in the crowd. So that's why he changed them to make them like bigger so they could like float in the air.
I'd say I first wonder what would happen in the first one, and the second one, like what they had made. Could you have noticed that no one was seeing in those 2 years?
The first one wasn't that big because it was the first parade.
Yeah, and it wasn't as popular.
And the second one still wasn't that big.
Is it?
And it scared the children away, so that's what
No, the lions and animals scared the children.
like I said. So you said it's scared.
Whatever.
So. Well, they did start to change the balloons with different stuff so it could
Silk.
float. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
They used rubber, but they didn't build
Rubbery rubber.
Then they use helium.
They use helium
Yeah,
to make it
Yeah,
lighter.
so I want to
Go
pause
up.
this for one moment because one thing that we do want to remember is let somebody finish their idea. So go ahead and finish.
I'm finished.
Okay.
Okay, so he changed from like rubber to like this silk kind of rubber, so it was lighter.
And
And it was called, at first they used sticks, but then like people couldn't like see it, and the sticks were actually heavy and stuff. And then they started using these little like strings to fit the ginormous light puppets.
And they used different helium.
so it won't be heavier from the air.
Plus it's like an upside down. And then it can go higher.
Yeah, it's upside down. Well, the puppet isn't upside down, but it's like an upside down marionette.
But it's not upside down.
No, but normally you hold the strings from the top and then holding it from the bottom.
So one of the things that you guys are starting to talk about, you're naming the changes from parade to parade and some of the reasons why, like definitely that first parade was dealing with the signs and the like smaller structures and then the animals, and there was a need to make some changes. One of the thing that drove some of the change was the kids and people in the parade being scared of the lions and tigers. So then Tony came up with this idea and then continued to change it because of some different reasons. So some of you were starting to think about like what you thought about those changes, and that's just something that we can continue anytime that we're reading and talking about our books, thinking about the changes that are happening and then why they might be happening and how we feel about those changes. So great job with the conversation today and just kind of naming some things that had happened, but then starting to think about why they might have happened, and that's something you can do in any time you're talking about a book. So what we're going to have you guys do